So, what do you think of when I say the word spiritual? Perhaps New Age bookstores or crystals, maybe yoga, a vegetarian diet, meditation, silence, singing bowls, walking in nature. A lot of different things probably come to mind with the word spiritual. Most of them have to do with physical objects or our bodies. At Tapestry this month, as Dave mentioned, we're talking about transformation. Today, I invite you to consider that the big spiritual transformations, the significant moments of growth and healing, have at least as much to do with our bodies as they do with our hearts, minds, and souls. In fact, slowing down enough to notice our bodies and the world around us may be the most powerful way we can transform our spiritual lives. One of the images that might come to mind with that word spirituality is the Buddha. We know the Buddha was the model of spiritual enlightenment. That's what the name means, after all, the enlightened one. His path to understanding was a very physical journey. The story of Siddhartha is probably familiar to many of you. I want to revisit it, though, and I encourage you to listen for how physical and material it all is. The story tells us that he was born a prince, Prince Gautama. He was raised in a palace in India with everything that word palace invokes. Big, lush, and expansive grounds. There were servants and cooks and gardeners and every sort of luxury that ancient India could provide. It was sensuous. Now, because of a premonition of a wise older person, Gautama's father, the king, was frightened for the boy's future. He tried to protect his son from every possible harm. The king forbade the prince from going outside of the palace walls and declared that he shouldn't see a single sick person or a disabled person or even an old person. Everything frightening or ugly was to be kept out of his royal sight. A distasteful piece of this story that we don't often tell is that the king so wanted his son to be happy that he selected the most beautiful young woman to be his son's wife and constructed palaces for the new couple, one for each season. Merchants came from faraway places and told their stories of India and China and Arabia and Persia and Egypt, making the young prince very curious what was out there. Through hunting, he found an excuse to leave the royal grounds and went beyond the walls. With his servant Channa hunting for deer, one day they came upon a man lying beside a rock, groaning and twitching with pain. Gautama was baffled and he asked Channa, "What was this all about?" And Channa explained, "It's the way of life. But this man is only a beggar, forget him." On another hunting adventure, Gautama and Channa met a man who was leaning on two canes. His hair was white, his face was wrinkled, and his hands shook like leaves. Again, baffled by this mysterious, strange sight, Gautama asked, "What was wrong?" And Channa explained, "It's something that comes to all who live a long time. Their bodies become tired and weak." "Don't trouble your mind, Gautama." But he was quite troubled. On yet another trip, Gautama came upon a hut in the woods. He opened the door to find a man who seemed to be sleeping, but would not wake up. "What's wrong with the man?" asked Gautama. Channa explained the man was dead. And Gautama asked, "What does dead mean?" "I cannot tell you," said Channa. "It's the way of all people. But don't let your mind be troubled by this." Well, without a word, Gautama jumped on his horse and rode home. That night, his wife had arranged a big party in the palace. But he was churning over and over in his mind these questions. Why must people suffer so? In the early morning, while it was still dark and the royal family was still asleep, Gautama slipped quietly out of the palace, leaving his parents and his wife and child behind. The prince for whom the crown and the kingdom were waiting was determined to find out for himself, so foregoing the cushioned bed, he slept on the hard ground next to the forest where wild animals were. And instead of his sumptuous meals on an elaborate table, he would beg for his food door to door or cook for himself one plain meal a day. Sometimes he lived alone, sometimes with a small group of other ascetics. Years passed this way, years of deprivation, and finally, dissatisfied with the lack of answers, he found a place to sit. Sitting under a tree, he proclaimed, "I will not leave until I have come to understand this suffering and the path of relieving it." Now, who can say exactly what happened under that tree? But the Buddha gained insight that has been the spiritual foundation for millions of people and thousands of years. His very first teaching was to those 5 ascetics who were living with him, and he advised them to give up those 2 extremes, either indulging in sensuous pleasures or tormenting the body. He advised them to follow a middle way, which is helpful in seeing things clearly as they are and attaining knowledge, higher wisdom, and peace. His very first teaching was about a moderate lifestyle. What followed was his teaching about the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. It's a long story, but the details of that story have persisted for a very long time. Each aspect of the story points to physical experience. Without coming to know those universal experiences of the body, without grappling with the reality of living in our bodies, Gautama never would have become the Buddha. Incidentally, Channa, the servant that exposed the Buddha to all these learnings, was one of his first disciples, and he himself also achieved enlightenment. Bodies aren't just these objects of inconvenience or beauty. Our bodies are the foundation of knowing and connecting with the world. One of the reasons our bodies are the key to transformation is that they are the only means that we have for connecting to the world around us. And more than anything else, spirituality has to be about connection and wholeness. The Unitarian minister, Reverend Gordon McKeeman, describes spirituality as recognizing the connections behind what we immediately see. Not just high-minded, poetic concepts of connection, but real, visceral, physical connection. Attending to the physical reality of our connections is a gateway to deeper truth. As he puts it, spirituality is about holiness or wholeness. It's the quest to perceive, feel, embrace, address any person, any event in its wholeness. And he uses a rose as an example. A rose is a simple, pretty thing in itself, but it's not perceived in its wholeness or holiness apart from the rose bush, roots, stems, thorns and all, or apart from the earth, sun, rain, fertilizer, gardener, admirers. Noticing these real points of connection makes the rose something magnificent. Appreciating those connections is a spiritual experience. The same sense of deeper perception applies to our neighbors as well. Sometimes more difficult to remember their holiness through the dull, stubborn, and sometimes even violent exterior. The temptation can be overwhelming to miss the whole person, the whole circumstance, the stories, the points of connection. Just as we miss the opportunity in seeing just the rose, the connections make the rose truly magnificent. Too often we also miss the opportunity seeing even our more intricate, beautiful points of connections with our human neighbors. Looking beneath the surface to recognize the very real physical points of connections is a transforming spirituality that our world deeply needs. There's nothing supernatural or metaphysical about it. It's just a matter of paying attention a little more closely. Bodies are not only the way of connecting with what's outside of us in the world, they're also the pathway of knowing our own inner world, our emotional and spiritual self. There was a book in 2018 called How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett that had a huge impact on me and my understanding of the importance of our bodies in our spiritual life. The book explains how generations of mental health professionals had understood sadness, happiness, joy, anger, and other emotions as the idea that all people experience these same things. We tend to think of emotions as states of mind that are common among all people. But current medical research demonstrates that's not how it works at all. There are no physiological manifestations to a particular emotion. Analyzing heart rate, blood pressure, even brain scans, scientists are unable to identify the biological characteristics of a simple emotion that's the same from one person to the next. With all these instruments, they fail to identify a common biological expression of something like happy, or sad, or afraid. What we call happy or sad or afraid manifests in a huge variety of different ways in different bodies, even within the same culture. In our bodies, we experience a flood of sensations. We experience pleasure and pain through our sense of touch. All our other sensations send messages to our brains, and based on that input, our brains offer a waterfall of chemical reactions and electrical pulses. All that data and raw experience of nerves, chemicals, and electrical pulses is incredibly complicated. The image that came to my mind this week is of a painter's palette with a bunch of different colors, putting in a putty knife and swirling it around and smearing that on a canvas. In our desire to relate to other people and to understand our experience, we share words like happy, sad, and angry. We borrow words from our culture, but they don't describe any physical reality. I know that's complicated, but there are two takeaways from that. First, since our emotional lives are basically our bodies responding to the world around us, the best place to start to deal better with our emotions is dealing better with our bodies. The foundation for cultivating spiritual grounding or emotional intelligence is basically what every nurse has ever told you. Get enough sleep, eat a balanced diet, drink water, exercise, and try something new every once in a while to stimulate your brain. Basic healthy habits aren't just for our bodies, they're for our emotional well-being, our spirit. No incantation or energy vortex, no arrangement of crystals or combination of lucky numbers will do as much for your soul as basic care for your body will. The second major learning about how emotions are made is about paying attention to our bodies. And I mean really closely paying attention, sort of like we did in our meditation. Putting a one-word label on emotions may help describe what's going on in a quick conversation, but what our body and our soul experience is way more nuanced. Mindfulness meditation teachers, borrowing from Buddhist tradition, have embraced a model of meditation that uses this body-mind connection in a powerful way. It's called RAIN. I imagine several of you have heard it. RAIN is an acronym for recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture. Mindfulness teacher Tara Brach is probably the person most associated with this, but several people use it. I want to walk through those steps briefly. If you want to use this as a little mini meditation of your own, you are welcome to do that. R is for recognize. Basically, what's going on. So much of our life is on autopilot or numbed by overstimulation. The first step is to recognize for a moment what's going on. What's the challenge at hand? Consciously acknowledge the thoughts, feelings, behavior of the challenge. A is for allow or accept. For a moment, accept that this reality is part of life. Let those thoughts, feelings, and situation be the current reality without trying to fix it or avoid it. And that takes a bit of courage, I know. But accept the challenge for the reality of the moment. And then investigate. The I of RAIN is about getting curious and investigating how this emotion shows up in your body. Is it a tightness in your gut or chest or head? Identify where it shows up in yourself and maybe what that area needs. It's interesting, you'll likely find that when you do identify that spot in your body, it starts to shift and change. Notice that too. And finally, N is for nurture. After the recognize, accept, and investigate, self-compassion begins to naturally arise in the moment. To do this, recognize what the challenge is and offer a gesture or a phrase of reassurance. For a lot of people, that means placing a hand on the heart. It may mean covering yourself with a blanket for a moment and offer the few words that you specifically might need in that moment. Probably the words you would tell your close friend. I'm here with you. I'm sorry. I love you. I'm listening. Trust in your goodness, but it really depends on what's going on and what you need. In my experience, that phrase, I'm listening, is a wildly powerful thing to tell myself. Recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture. Through noticing the sensations that rise up in our bodies, there are a couple of benefits. The immediate one is a little comfort and stability of mind and peace. The long-term benefit, though, is some confidence in knowing that we know how to deal with emotions as they arise. In life, it turns out that the answer is often much simpler than we are willing to believe. Taking simple care of and noticing our beautiful, complicated bodies is one of those very simple answers that we often don't want to believe. Making the commitment to slow down and pay attention is one of the most powerful ways that we can grow our spiritual lives. Amen.